Hi, I'm Tony, and this is something to consider. Last week, we talked about discretion in the law, but I was running at the same time, and the conversation was admittedly a little half-baked. So this week, we're going to cook it completely. So, what is discretion? It's a lot of things, but the kind we're talking about has to do with executive power. You see, in a government, there are laws that get written, there are judgments passed on those who break them, but somewhere in between, someone needs to actually enforce those laws. In order for the government machine to do its job, you need your police, your FBIs and FDAs and EPAs, even the president himself, to decide how to pull the trigger. And that's where discretion comes in. The freedom to decide how to apply the law in a particular situation. Now, why is this important? The truth is, applying the law exactly as it is written to every situation in which it applies is sometimes a great way to screw everything up and hurt people. How about an example? Let's hop on the internet.
In the year 2013, Florida goofed up a law pretty badly. A charity tied to people in the government was suspected of being a front for a sort of gambling cafe. It became a bit of a scandal, and a knee-jerk law was written to essentially ban slot machines in internet cafes. Problem is, the law was a bit rushed, and it did a really poor job of defining what slot machines actually are. As a result, it applied to just about anything that could be used in any capacity as a slot machine. And boy, have you seen what some people do with the internet. So, long story short, Florida accidentally banned all computers and smartphones in the state, and according to the law, a whole bunch of people living there were now criminals. Of course, there's much more to this story, but the important part is that when that law was passed and when its shoddy wording was realized, Florida's executive powers didn't start shutting down every facility in the state that owned a computer. That insanity was avoided because its executive powers exercised discretion in their enforcement of the law. Even if in this case it was the obvious thing to do. They tried to steer it towards its intended purpose, targeting gambling and internet cafes. Of course, people weren't happy about how they did enforce that law either, but that's a story for another day.
Now, that's a rather still an extreme example, but it illustrates a point. Laws are written by humans. They are not perfect, and sometimes it is unreasonable to apply them the same way to all situations. Usually unless the law is very specific about how it should be applied. Sometimes it's unreasonable to apply it at all, although that gets into other legal questions besides discretion. Still, discretion is part of why it's unlikely you'll be pulled over for doing 5 miles over the speed limit, even if you drive past a cop. It's why you can smoke weed in some states without being arrested, though the ones that let people sell it are a bit more complicated. And to a certain extent, it's why single people can have sex in Minnesota, because that's technically illegal. More importantly, however, it's why you should be very skeptical when a person or group tries to shirk responsibility for their actions by protecting themselves with the text of the law. Someone's got to pull the trigger on these things, and just following orders without further thought is how people have pulled the trigger on some of the worst ideas in human history. It's even relevant in many situations today. Should a school suspend a child for standing up to a bully just because rules exist that prohibit fighting? Should someone be charged with homicide when they acted in defense of their own life? Here's an important one. Should we indiscriminately separate families arriving in the U.S. without documentation just because they aren't documented? I've researched the laws in question with that one. They give the government powers and boundaries. I mean, we've detained all kinds of children before, but how and to what extent? That isn't completely specified in the law. Like many other things in our government, it was discretionary. If you don't see the importance of this kind of discretion in families, schools, governments, any authority really, I beg you to consider it. Because even if none of these examples resonate with you, someday you might be caught up in some nasty stuff. Maybe you own a computer in Florida. Point is, if it's ever your ass that's on the line, I'd imagine that discretion becomes pretty important. The question, then, is when and how should our government exercise discretion? But that's something to consider for another time. Peace. All right. I'm happy with that one.